Okay, this is from Qing Dynasty to Modern China for AP World History. Today we're going to cover the decline and collapse of the Qing Dynasty, including the cultural shift that was often conservative, the Opium Wars, Taiping Rebellion, Boxer Rebellion, and the end of China's final dynasty. So the Qing dynasty ran from 1644 to 1911. In 1644, the Ming dynasty ended because the emperor committed suicide in Beijing, which was one of those internal reasons, as we've talked about internal and external. As a result of that power vacuum, the armies of the rebel Manchus sacked the city, which would therefore be an external reason. The Manchus come to power at the beginning of the Qing dynasty, but they were not nomadic horsemen like the Mongols had been, but rather they were hunters and fishers and farming people in Manchuria, which is northeast of the Great Wall and east of Mongolia. They believed themselves to be the descendants of Jurchen, who ruled China during the Jin dynasty. This was the first time that the Chinese resisted these new rulers. The Manchus forced all of the Chinese in Beijing to move to the southern part of the city, and Chinese men now had to show submission through their hair, regardless of their rank or their station. And this is because when rebels took over Taiwan, which is off of the coast, it's an island off the coast of China, in 1683, the Manchu government had made all soldiers conform to Manchu dress and attire there. What that means is that they have to shave their foreheads and have a braid in their hair into a pigtail, which is called a queue, which is what you see there in the picture. The Chinese men didn't like it, but they saw little alternative since it's such a public submission, and this is really a lot of why the Chinese resisted the Manchu rule. Between 16 Eventually, the Manchus adopted the Chinese political system. They began by reaffirming the old Chinese gentry's place. In fact, because they weren't Chinese, it made it a little bit easier to break with some of the long-standing but often paralyzing patterns of the court's politics. But ultimately, the Manchus adopted the Chinese political system, which gave them some legitimacy as Chinese rulers, at least in the eyes of the Chinese. Between 1669 and 1799, China was only ruled by 3 Manchu emperors, which means that having all that political stability with just a few rulers was really helpful to establishing the dynasty rather than just some sort of rebellion. People were willing to work hard at the art of governing under all 3 of these rulers. And the Manchu were quite open to the West. In fact, one of these emperors appointed Jesuits to direct this imperial board of astronomy when the predictions of the Jesuits proved more accurate than those of the Chinese. And in 1692, the same emperor issued an edict tolerating Christianity as long as they would still continue practicing ancestral veneration. So they were strangely open to the West, well, at least religiously. While the leaders were glorifying the Manchus and preserving culture, there was also this darker side to it, and that's that they opposed any criticism of their rule. Any hint of anti-Manchu activity was brought down with quick and forceful action. They had all of the books ever written in China collected for a, quote, worthy bibliography project, but then they went through and made sure that any of the copies that were offending or made slighting or even bad references to the Manchus were completely destroyed. And at this point, historians estimate that no copies have been recovered for nearly 2,000 titles. The Manchus also built very little with some territory known as Tibet, which was an autonomous region. If we go back to look at this map, it's there on the western side of China, which is sort of this new area that comes under rule. So they let tribal leaders continuing to govern their people. So in Tibet and the largely Muslim areas of northwest China could keep their own religious leader and dietary rules and not have the queue. So they were fairly autonomous. So I'm going to put that in quotation marks since they were not really recognized as an autonomous region. Culture took a conservative turn during the rule of the Manchus. Remember, we've talked about this just with the French Revolution, where you have liberal, conservative sort of dealing with change and about how governance should happen. The population increase outpaced the growth of resources, which really was a problem in a factor in causing the White Lotus Rebellion of 1796 to 1804. The increased pressure on land because of population growth made it harder for peasants, and it ultimately led to a peasant revolt. I hope that you're seeing that this is a pattern throughout history of some of that social unrest of the lower class. It was really difficult for the government to suppress these rebellions because there were so many people involved in them, and the population increase made society become more competitive. During this conservative time, also deviant behavior laws became a lot harsher. So anything that the Manchus deemed to be deviant, which would include homosexuality, also a very high concern for women's purity. So the staggering increase in the number of faithful widows who refused to remarry was high during this time. And it also meant that there were a lot of group homes for impoverished widows, where visits by men were actually strictly limited and almost eliminated. Many Confucian scholars concluded that the Ming Dynasty had fallen from moral laxness, and so the moral rigidness of the Qing Dynasty makes sense in this conservative culture of the Manchus. Under the Manchus, women were also still inferior. Only men could have formal education. Only men could pursue a career in government. Men could divorce his wife if she didn't produce any sons. So there's still a very high need for that male heir within families. Foot binding practice emerged. Scholars don't really know the origins. We've talked about this a little bit when we were looking at the Opium Wars a few weeks ago. They believe that it began with the upper class and then it spread into all classes where the bound feet become a status symbol. Women with bound feet were more marriageable, and therefore there was an economic incentive to bind the child's foot from a very young age. So even just shortly after birth, the feet would be broken or bent and then tied and wrapped very tightly for hours on end. Ultimately, what it means is that women can't walk and they had to be carried all around because of the shaping of their foot, because it made it impossible to put weight on it. And then lower class women were ultimately looked down upon because they required their feet for field mobility, which means that they could not be a part of this. Now, this is, again, not a cultural thing that we want to impose as some sort of like freak instance, because this is really, we could make a lot of relationships to the corset of European women. Okay, so trade in the Qing Dynasty. Until the 1700s, China's standard of living and the material culture was largely unrivaled and was the best in the world, and that's because of their really strict and cautious trade decisions. The primary trade partners, however, had been passed around different countries at different points in time, between Spain and Portugal, then the Dutch, and ultimately the British. Which sort of rivals a lot of what was happening in European politics. During the English and Chinese trade, the trade was mostly handled by government-to-government monopolies. The English had the British East India Company, which was a joint stock company, and the Chinese had the Kohong, which is the official merchant guild in Guangzhou, which is, let's see right here, and that is also known in modern day as Canton, or what people, there's two languages in China. So there's Mandarin, which is the majority language, and then Cantonese, which is often found in southeast China. The British wanted to trade more, but they were restricted to the small island off the coast of Guangzhou, which is here, and that began in 1759. In order to keep foreigners from disrupting Chinese society in the city, they were obligated to reside in a special quarter, and they could only stay as long as their business was required. But the thing is that the British demand for tea was like, let's just say it was like off the chain. Like, whereas you could have been like 5 chests of tea being imported in 1684, it was 400,000 pounds by 1720 and 23 million pounds by 1800. The British really, really, really wanted Chinese tea, which was grown in tea leaves, which is the picture you see there on the right. So this desire for tea helped increase the flow of silver into China. Commercial capitalism, i.e., remember that's private businesses based off of profit from investments, not related to the actual development of product. So commercial capitalism didn't develop in China like in Europe. The middle-class merchants and manufacturers weren't as independent as those in Europe, and trade and manufacturing in China was under the control of the Chinese government. Trade and manufacturing in China was also seen as inferior to farming because there was such a need for population that farming has to become this thing that is actually quite popular. Unfortunately, the Chinese government perpetuated this mindset by levying higher taxes on trade and manufacturing and lowering taxes on farming. But as the population grew, there was less farmland available, and therefore more people had to go into trade and manufacturing, which created this like shunned middle class of people who had to be involved. The European view of China changed away from rosy and peachy and that of inferior. The Jesuits who had been involved in China had this fantastic view of China, would often go back describing in Europe all of its unbelievableness, but they did so because they wanted financial help for funding for more missions, which is, I guess, something that we could really think about in terms of like a DBQ, like looking at the reasons for why Europeans would have this positive, religious Europeans would have this positive view of China. Philosophers like Voltaire were praising China for its ability to have a society on ethics, like Confucianism, and not on religion. Um, but Voltaire, was part of the European Enlightenment movement, which placed all of that emphasis on the individual. Similarly, other philosophers like Montesquieu and Rousseau were describing China as inferior because there was no liberty. So we have a real big conflict between the types of narratives that are being perpetuated during this time. But the shift in attitudes during the Enlightenment and in this ultimate debate parallels the emergence of England as the military hegemon during this time, which we have already talked about during formal imperialism. So this led to the British government and merchants demanding some change from the Chinese government about trade because the British really, really, really wanted to be able to get cheaper goods by trading closer to the source of materials. Um, Ultimately, the British were restricted to that trade outlet at Guangzhou, so back here to this picture, and they really didn't like it. There was this unfair balance of trade where there was more importing than exporting to China, which favored the British. The British were importing tea and silk and porcelain, and the British paid for goods with Indian cotton. But cotton wasn't enough, so the British had to supplement with silver. And it seems like that conflict was inevitable since the Chinese didn't want to conform to European trade models, and the British had the power to make the Chinese acceptably force their terms. The British then turned to trading opium, which is grown in northern India by the British East India Company. And opium is highly addictive. We've already talked about this with the Opium War. It's a derivative of the poppy plant. Been used in China for medicinal purposes, like things like to end diarrhea or to deal with like fevers, but unfortunately the withdrawal symptoms are severe cramps and muscle twitching and chills. And even today, all of these opioids can turn you from, a decently looking, person into literally the same person in this picture on the right, just over their opioid use, and it can happen in a matter of weeks. So if we go back, it got silver flowing back out of China and back to Britain, which was helpful for the British since they were so upset over their unfavored exporting and unfair balance of trade. The Chinese government already knew that it was harmful to have opium, and they banned the trade of opium. And the Chinese even begged the British to stop on the moral grounds. So ultimately, if we look at it, it went from giving cotton to silver, and then ultimately into opium as a way to continue to control that trade. The Chinese ultimately they created a blockade over the foreign area in Guangzhou to force traders to surrender their opium chests so that they could dump them out. This led to the British responding with force since they felt like this was an act against the British. And the British destroyed the Chinese coastal and river forts sort of swiftly since they were this big military hegemon. Ultimately, this ends with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, where the Chinese agreed to give Britain 5 ports, 21 million Mexican silver dollars, this is what's called indemnity. So that means that is a payment for wrongdoings after a conflict. The British also get the island of Hong Kong, which they held well into the 1980s, and they get a fixed 5-cent tariff, and a tariff is just an import tax. Later, opium was legalized in a treaty in 1860. There were approximately 18 million people, or up to 50% of the Chinese populace addicted by 1860. Okay, so more internal conflicts that continue to happen. China still hasn't really dealt with some of their internal economic problems as they have that issue between the trade of manufacturing and farming. The Taiping Rebellion was a peasant revolt. Again, more social unrest from the lower class. I hope you're starting to see a theme. This was led by Hong Qiuquan, who's a Christian convert. He believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, so Jesus apparently has a younger Chinese brother many decades later. He was convinced that God gave him the mission to destroy the Qing dynasty, and he and peasants captured the town of Yangon. He and the peasants that he was with in this Taiping Rebellion proclaimed a new dynasty called the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, or in Chinese would be the Taiping Tianguo. So because of that, that's where it gets the name Taiping Rebellion, or the Great Peace Rebellion. His movement appealed to a lot of people, especially the lower class, because his reforms were very much based in social equity. So he gave land to all peasants. He had gender equality between men and women. Women even served in the army. Although they were in separate units, they were serving in military forces in the Taiping Army. He asked all people to give up their personal private possessions in order to have this communal type possessions. He outlawed all tobacco, he outlawed all alcohol, and he eliminated foot binding. So all things considered, he was pretty much a social revolutionary of his time. The movement got its start in underground in some of the secret societies. In March 1853, rebels took Nanjing, which is the second largest city. They end up killing 25,000 women, men, and children. And after a battle, if there was anyone left, they rounded them up and they killed them too, including kids, which was really unfortunate that this Taiping Rebellion, who had really, that Hong had really perpetuated all of this social equality, ends up having such